I think I'm live.
Okay, good luck, Sissy.
Am I live?
I will tell you now.
Can you check if it's live?
I'm gonna check now for you. Yes, you are live, Salasa. Good luck and God bless you.
Okay, this is it.
Yeah, that's it. We'll see you in an hour.
In an hour, so I'm going.
Bye, Lerato.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Lerato.
You're live.
Okay.
You're live.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I guess I should greet everyone in this page. Okay, I'm sorry, but we struggled to get this talk going today, and so I don't know where to start and what to do, but we will wing it. We'll see what is happening. So it's 7:20, and I think I will just talk until like 7:45, just to try and quickly say the things that need to be said. Okay, my name is Lerato Kobe. I am a lecturer in missiology at the University of South Africa. I'm a PhD candidate in VU Amsterdam and also at the University of Pretoria. I am a Desmond Tutu scholarship holder. So one of my projects is on African spirituality. So I mean, the disciplines that I work with, it's Black theology and African spirituality. So today I'm supposed to give a talk about African spirituality and Ubuntu. I guess the topic is African spirituality of Ubuntu, but I'm supposed to go to look at this through Professor Vuyani Velem's theology of liberation, Black theology of liberation. So I'm going to start by saying, so I've published a paper last year on Professor Vuyani's theology of Black theology of liberation and what he is calling us to do as Black theologians, as also African theologians. And so I used one of his articles in this article that he says that he argues that we must try to unthink the West. And in this article, in his article, Unthinking the West, part of the things that he deals with, he argues that for a long time as Black theologians, we have tried to work with the paradigms of Black theology of liberation within the context of doing theology. And he argues that though we've worked for a long time with these paradigms in Black theology of liberation, we constantly go back and wanting to prove ourselves how these paradigms are academic enough or are good enough to be used as paradigms in theology. So, and then he argues, Uguti, it's time that we stop as Black theologians and start working on the work that needs to be done. And I think if we remember, this debate have been already there in the 80s, in the 80s, where people like Professor Itumeleng Masola and others have argued already that for the hope of Black theology surviving, and where Black theology should be at, Black theology should concentrate on African spirituality and doing church in Africa. And I mean, I think I've done this round before, where I have articulated these debates, where especially Professor Itumeleng Masola or even asked, do we even need the Bible as Africans? But anyway, so I'm taking this debate from that context, that the hope of Black theology, of Black theology of liberation, lies in African religiosity, in African spirituality. So I'm taking this talk from there. So what I'm working on is thinking through how we can develop Ubuntu as a spirituality of liberation for Black theology. And therefore here, perhaps I'm not gonna dig deeper in Professor Vianney Velem's theology, but of course this article is inspired by him, because one of his argument is that in South Africa post 1994, there are two cultures that are in conflict with one another, and there is the culture, and there is the post 1994 culture, and he argues, and I guess if we take this at church, to look at it at church, we'll say our church is always in conflict with two cultures that are always competing with one another. And I'm not sure if really in terms of African spirituality there's much of competition, because African spirituality has not been allowed a space within our churches to survive, to live and breathe peacefully. So there is the Western culture that comes in the form and the fact that the founder of the Methodist Church, for example, is Wesley. John Wesley, because John Wesley is a British priest who comes with his theology bound up and made up out of the British culture. Therefore, some theologians, for example, I have a book here on my bookshelf that says Spiritualities of the World, and John Wesley's spirituality is titled British Spirituality, because this is a spirituality that is born out of that specific context. It's exactly what Biko tries to alert us to say, that while Christianity in everywhere in the world adapted itself within the culture and tradition of that specific space, but when it came to Africa, it was rigid and it could not adapt into the context of those people who live in that particular area. So, and this is the background. And I'm not gonna go back to the struggles, because I think I've done that time and time again. So I'm just gonna go straight to the work that I am doing. So in my framing of Ubuntu, I try and frame Ubuntu within a Black theology of liberation. And the reason why I do this, it's because and also this argument is an old one. It's not my argument. It's an old argument that when we speak about African culture in decolonial spaces, or whether we speak about African theology and all of these things, we have to start, our premise has to be within the context of Blackness. And this is why then I frame Ubuntu within the context of Black theology of liberation, because the reason why the argument says that we must begin from Blackness, it's because the argument is that when we argue straight from the perspective of, or the viewpoint, or we frame our work within the context of, we jump to African culture, we miss the history of Christianization and colonialization of our people. Therefore, we miss the history of enslavement and all the frontier wars and all that has happened, because then we are jumping to the past and moving from the past without actually unpacking that actually we are colonized people. We are people now who go to a Christian church, which is actually coming from Europe, which is the Methodist Church. And so Black theology helps us to be truthful of our context, of the violence of colonialization and Christianity. And therefore, this is why then I frame Ubuntu within Black theology, because I don't want to leave behind that experience of colonialization and Christianization. And Prof. Yanni Velem speaks about this in one of his articles, where he articulates that we in South Africa, we have three kinds of churches. We have the settler church that serves the needs of the settlers' interest in South Africa. And of course, an example of this, apartheid theology, apartheid itself as a policy comes out of the Dutch Reformed Church. And because the way they need to think theology, do theology, was to put the interest of the settlers first. And then we move to the second kind of church that he speaks about, which is the colonial missionary churches. And the colonial missionary churches includes the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, all of these churches. These are the churches that came into our communities, Black communities, and invited our ancestors. Well, maybe invite is not the right word, because they were not really invited. It was a matter of you convert or you perish. But these churches were built within the context, within our communities. And these are the churches, in fact, that Biko says they are the poisoned well in which our people are forced to drink. And these are the churches that he actually critiqued, that even your way of speaking about reconciliation is problematic at that time in the 70s, because these missionary colonial churches were preaching peace, reconciliation, and all of these very nice concepts while people were in war, you know. And these are the colonial missionary churches. And the missionary colonial churches are actually the churches at the center of land conquest. And then we move to the third, which is I base my research on, which is the freedom churches, the struggle churches. And the struggle churches are your independent churches, are the churches that we as Black people look down upon, and which is the Zion Church, the St. John's, and all of these churches. And if you go back in history and read about the history of these churches, you will realize that these churches, the reason why they broke away from the mainline churches, it was a question of liberation. It was a question of liberating Black people from the yoke of Christianity within these mainline churches. And an example of that Professor Vuyani Velem speaks about is Umamu Nondeta. So Nondeta started this a church, I think in the Eastern Cape, and in her church, if I'm correct, I'm not sure, but I think her church was a St. John's church, something similar to that. But I'm not sure. If you are able to get that information for me, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But what is interesting that Professor Vuyani Velem speaks about is that Nondeta taught people African values. So her way of teaching, of doing theology, she used the African tools, which is she used African spirituality, African culture to interpret the Bible. And Umamu Nondeta ended up being incarcerated because the administration of the mainline churches used to report these kind of churches, and then the government will come, which was the white government, will come and arrest these people or torture them or and do so many things to them, solely because they teach the African values, they teach Ubuntu, they teach African spirituality. So most of these indigenous churches, you can call them indigenous churches or independent churches, the reason why they broke away from those churches, it was a theological crisis where they argued that you cannot just move the way of knowing God from Europe and just ship that way of knowing God that is that embodies a Western spirituality, Western culture, and ship it to Africa. You need to give Africans also time to define who God is. And I mean, this is not something new that they were asking, because that's what exactly Western Christianity did to the Bible. This was they did to the story of Jesus, because this is a Jewish boy, and therefore how Europeans interpreted this story that is Jewish, that doesn't belong to them, they used also their own ways of telling stories. And then I mean, you can find this even just in the Gospel of John. Theologians usually argue that the Gospel of John is so mixed with Greek culture. Logos, that's the first beginning of the Gospel of John. But anyway, moving from that, so this is where for me I based African spirituality as coming from the context of theology and a context of being a preacher, and also within the global South. And being a theologian. So therefore I use then I start from Black theology and narrate these encounters. And part of those encounters is the story of Mamu Nondeta I'm telling you about, but part of those stories is the story of our own Usiak Dumisa. What are the stories we tell our children around Siak Dumisa? What are the stories that we tell our children around Liza Lisi Dingalako? Because Liza Lisi Dingalako also is written by Dio Soga in a context where he's trying to revive the people in the time of Ingaule, you know. And of course that song has been changed by the Methodist Church, and perhaps not by only the Methodist Church, but the mainline churches. Because you will see that these songs are common within the Presbytery, within the Anglican Church, within the Methodist Church, because the missionaries needed to infuse their conversion. Anyway, so going back then to what was Ubuntu. And I mean, this is tough to go through this talk, because I had prepared so many slides. But what I will do, I will just talk about African religiosity, because I just wanted to bring about the background within this. What is Ubuntu? So and so. Benazet Bujo argues that in Africa, in African ethics, the centeredness of God has not been really explored by theologians, but African ethics center around human beings, around humanity. They are anthropocentric, and therefore the reason why they center around the community. So Benazet Bujo argues that it's because salvation for the African community is about what you do, how you treat others within this context of living here on earth. Being a good human being is not something that comes with a reward, but it's something that is expected of you simply because you are a human being. And therefore, Benazet Bujo argues that African communities are made up of three communities, which is, it is the living community, it is those who are yet to be born, which is the next generation that is coming, that this living community does everything for the sake of this coming community. That when they find this earth, when they find this land, they can find it still conducive for them to live in. And an example of this, when now we talk about the environment, and usually Africans want to look to the West for environmental ethics and all of these things. But Professor Dinigo Maluleke, there's an article he once wrote, I am an African, therefore I grieve for my dog Bruno. But here he was trying to tell a story on how African community, the animals, the trees, that everything that is in the ecosystem is part of the community. And this is why we have, therefore, iziduko, clan names. When I say Ndinguqiha, Unojaholo, Unzwenzwe, people know that the Qiha people's totem is water. In African spirituality, there is that belief that when I leave this earth, I inherit the waters. And I think it's the same, it's therefore the same for all the clan names. The clan names are connected to how also we treat the environment. And therefore we can't do certain things in the waters, because we know we can't throw plastics, we can't do this, we can't do that and that, because we believe that this is where we will be in after this life we are in. And it goes on and on the clan names. So the clan names relate closely on how we treat and how we are steward of the environment, of nature, of everything that is living. And therefore, Prof. Tinigo Maluleke speaks about this. And then Prof. Benazet Bujo speaks about the living dead. And the living dead are the ancestors. And these ancestors are the ones who give the directives, are the ones we get our ethics from, are the ones that we get also ways of doing justice in society from. So, and therefore, and then he argues, therefore, in African ethics, in African religiosity, these three communities are important because they must be in communion with one another for the wholeness of society. And of course, questions like, questions like this communal, because we live in a world of capitalism and individualism. And I mean, I know I've presented in many conferences overseas where you get attacked for arguing for community. Because for Westerners, it means that if you prioritize the community, then you neglect the individual. And Benazet Bujo argues this is not true. We do not neglect, though African communities are built upon community, are built upon Ubuntu. And I have not even touched what Ubuntu entails here, maybe. I think I should have maybe started there, because Ubuntu revolves around I am because we are, and I am because we are go in opposite sides with Deka. I think, therefore I am, and therefore these different ways of thinking about the world, about being, about what it means to live, then they clash. And they clash because for Western education, I think, therefore I am. I know that I exist because I am. I think, therefore I am. But African communities, they say, I am because we are, because, like I've told you, that the living community, the living dead, and those who are yet to come are in community with one another. Therefore, you do not exist. You are not self-made in an American language. You are made by those people who surround you, those people who brought you up, your ancestors, even if we deny it as people of church, but you will not be carrying your surname or your clan names if you were not coming from a community. So therefore, Benazet Bujo argues, no, we do not deny the individual, because otherwise, why would we give names to our children? Just by giving name to a child, because in Africa it's so important how you name the child, and the events that surround in naming the child, because naming carries the history, carries the experience of people. Naming is an archive, is a library. When a child is named, for example, just the name that comes into my mind, Badigas, the likeliness is that at that time when this child was being born, there were certain events that were happening in that particular society that then made them to name. There were bad things that were happening that made this society to name that, but that child carries the meaning of that codex, but also is given this name so that the child can charge into the future and be able to also change or achieve or be be something. So so now I jump from there, and then I go straight to Ubuntu. Therefore, within this African community, the living, the dead, and those who are yet to come, the only way that explains life is that we are in community with one another. And this is one of the things that made me to explore Ubuntu as a spirituality of Black theology of liberation, because therefore, for us to be able to liberate ourselves from colonialization, that we are able to decolonize, we must be able to use sources that we own and we understand them clearly. And for me, Ubuntu philosophy is that you just don't come in the world, but you are connected to people. And I think even if we deny within the church context that we are connected to others, I was preaching yesterday and I said, in our church, the fact that we follow the teachings of John Wesley, it shows how much important those who have left us, the departed, the living dead, are still with us. Because if we teach the teaching of John Wesley is still alive because we still keep his teaching. This is the same thing that African theologians and African Black theologians mean about what is the community according to Africans. So one of my contributions in this debate of centering Ubuntu as a philosophy, as a spirituality of liberation, it also comes from the idea that when we think about heaven, when we think about salvation, it always revolves around I. I once led a class in my church, and we spoke about salvation. And I remember when I use African spirituality to explain what salvation is, that salvation for Africans through Ubuntu, it's not by me being only blessed, but it's by all of us being blessed and all of us being able to move together to the salvation of God. And I remember one of the people were sitting there, they were really disturbed by what I said, because then trying to look at salvation as communal. And they said to me, but the Bible says salvation is something that you should work for as an individual. Then I asked the question, would you really be happy in heaven when your whole entire family, your children, your husband are in hell, and then you are in heaven? Will you look down in hell and rejoice? Will that really be heaven, or will it be hell in heaven? And the person couldn't answer, because we never sit down, and this is part of colonial education, of missionary education, is that we don't think about the things that we say in church, what they actually mean in practical terms. So therefore I asked, will that be heaven? But if you look at salvation through African spirituality, salvation is salvation through community. And I think we can also make such a claim that otherwise, if salvation was such an individualistic thing, why would Jesus waste his time and energy and come on earth for us to be saved? If it was such a something that was not something that was communal, why would he build this entire movement with the disciples? Even when they rejected Christ, even when they deny him and he's crucified, but in his resurrection, he comes back to the community. Because the community is important for our salvation. So therefore, I use Ubuntu as that. And I think working on a theology of Ubuntu or African spirituality of Ubuntu in South Africa is important. Especially with our history of apartheid and all those things, where Ubuntu was used to mean forgiveness, which is Ubuntu doesn't mean forgiveness or compassion, but Ubuntu is a worldview. Ubuntu is a way of life, is a way of community, is a way of being in the world, to always be in solidarity with others, to always be in communion with others. And I think if our churches can focus to this spirituality of Ubuntu, we will not look at ourselves as being special when we pass people living in the streets. We can't even assist them because we think we deserve all the good things. And if things go bad for us, like under COVID-19, last year, there were people that argued they will be protected by God because they are believers. And the question was, so are you saying the grandmother who is struggling in the villages, in the township, deserves to die of COVID-19? What sin that grandmother has committed that you say that they deserve? So if using African spirituality in our way of doing church and being church helps us become more human, and this is one of the arguments of legal, that the contribution of Africa to the world, and I will argue the contribution of African theology to the world, or Black theology, is also giving this more human face, where we don't consume everything as individuals, but we share what we have with one another. And therefore, for me, when we start doing that, actually we follow the teachings of Jesus, because everything he did it in communion with others. Even when he was not amongst others, but even when he is in the wilderness, he is there because of others. And this thing of this kind of ethics that we have, that I deserve everything should come to me first. And I think this is something that the indigenous churches have than us. I once went to a St. John's Church in Khayelitsha, and I was shocked how many things that the church is doing for the community. And it's not extravagant. It's not, I mean, the church that I saw there, it was, if you could imagine when Jesus met that guy that he told, take your mat and leave, you could imagine that this was the environment of church, where people are there with their sickness, with their needs, but they are there so that the church to help them. And part of our problem as the mainline churches is that because of our theology comes from empire theology, we spiritualize everything. And when I say we spiritualize everything in a foreign spirituality that's not meant for us to survive, to live. In fact, to live, not to survive, because we are surviving as Africans under the Western spirituality. But we need to get to a space where we stop surviving, but we start living. We exist in the world. And I think this is one of the reasons I work on Ubuntu spirituality, that We need a spirituality that speaks to the spirit, to the soul of the African, and the experiences of the African in the world. And until we are able to think about what we believe in, like the example I just gave you, that I asked someone in a class once, will you really be happy in heaven if you and your children, you are separated from your children, and your children are in hell, your entire family is in hell, and it's only you who is in heaven? Will that be really heaven? So the question really is, what does heaven look like? And for me, I will argue, heaven looks like Ubuntu. Heaven looks like Ubuntu, where we don't think about us only, but we think about us as a community. And issues of justice, issues of poverty, issues of suffering can be then met if we start doing theology this way. And for right now, I will argue, Guti, there's no hope for me for now in the mainline churches that we can take this spirituality on. The hope for me is in the indigenous churches, because we, as we are living still within the mainline churches, we are in conflict with one another, with loving being a Methodist or being an African. So these things are always in conflict with one another, because loving being a Methodist and following the ancestor we call John Wesley. And I wonder if John Wesley would want us to follow him in such blankers, because even John Wesley didn't follow church with blindedly. This is why John Wesley argued the world is my parish. He went to teach the gospel to the people that he was not supposed to teach it to. The people that at the time of the coming out of the Methodist Church, it was the time where if you are blessed, we needed to see it, the kind of life you are living. And then we say, God has blessed you because you have. And those who didn't have, it was argued, it's because they've sinned, they've done something wrong, that is why they live like this. Therefore, we don't preach the gospel to these people. And John Wesley argued that this is not how it is. Jesus taught the Bible to the lowly of community, to those who were oppressed in society. He put a woman in the forefront in the ministry. There's no way that a material or all these things that show that you have been a good follower of Jesus, and therefore he broke the rules, and then he went to preach in the minds. And I think therefore in this way John Wesley will not expect us not to adapt even his theology to our own culture and our own experience and how we have known God in our lives. And so in those words, I think I will end, because there's so much that could be said, because this is still a developing project, Ubuntu as a spirituality for Black theology of liberation. But the reason why I'm developing this theory, it's to argue if we could do church differently and do theology differently, if the church cannot actually be able to touch so many lives. Because then if we use Ubuntu as a paradigm, as a way of doing theology, therefore we don't center only ourselves and be like the Pharisees but we center everyone. Everyone comes to God equally, and everyone comes to God deserving justice and deserving healing. It's not, and I think this is one of my biggest struggle with Christianity, the exclusiveness of being that I deserve things, so others deserve to suffer. I must get things first. Everything must be mine. And of course, we to such an extent we can't blame people some, because this is what colonialism has done to us. A European conversion into Christianity, and because Christianity, when it came, it was not about the gospel. It was actually about conquering. It was about conquering more worlds to rule. And therefore, Christianity comes as part of this. And I think within the space of decoloniality in the church and decolonizing theology, we as Africans, we begin to ask this question: what does salvation mean for an African in truthful sense? And for me, I will argue salvation looks like Ubuntu. I thank you. I don't know how then if we have comments, since I am the only one on this live chat, if there's anyone who has questions and stuff. Okay, I don't see any comments. So I think I will end the video and
Hello?
yes.